clearly connected to the climate, and I think Bill will be getting more into some of the details on the climate. I'm also going to broaden this a little bit in terms of the agreement. Clearly, the TPP is the agreement that is front and center right now because it's so close to completion. But I'm also focusing on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, for a couple of reasons. One is that if you take these two agreements together, they are really setting the standards for what will be trade policy in the future. And certainly the U.S. and EU governments have been very clear on this, that they want to set what they call the gold standards. So issues that developing countries have refused to negotiate in the past, like investment or procurement or competition policy, the standards will likely be set in these two agreements. The other issue is that for whatever reason, we're getting a lot of information leaked out of the European Union. You may know that these trade agreements are negotiated in secret, so it's often hard to know exactly what's happening. In the case of TTIP, I'm not sure how all these documents are coming our way, but we get things, every week or two? Draft text, meeting reports, and different things, so we know a lot more about what's on the table in TTIP, and many of the issues will be similar. So, when we enter into the trade debate, I think both Bill and I have been at this since the NAFTA debate. We're not starting from ground zero. We have a long time of experience with the different trade agreements. And when we think of our food systems, there are some pretty clear impacts in all three countries in NAFTA. So you may have heard that in the wake of NAFTA, tariffs on corn were gradually eliminated, but there was a flood of corn going into corn exports to Mexico. Exports increased something like 400%. And a lot of this was corn that, because of our production system, was really below the cost of production. It was devastating for small-scale farmers in Mexico, and there are estimates that something like 2.3 million people were displaced from their lands because of the influx of cheap corn. Another piece of the story that we looked into a couple of years ago was how it changed the food environment in Mexico. When the corn went in, there was a lot of that corn went for animal feed, so there was more beef, more dairy available, so fat consumption rose, but also with the changes in investment, there were huge increases in fast food restaurants, in snack food processing, in supermarkets rather than local markets. And so the default food environment in Mexico shifted. It became more like ours. And in essence, we exported our obesity problem. Now Mexico and the U.S. are tied for the highest obesity rates in the world. So this is something, it's not just the tariffs, it's a lot of these other issues that come into this. And in the U.S., it hasn't been positive for American farmers either. One of the papers that's over on the table there is a letter we just sent to Congress earlier this week from 113 farm and food organizations, a lot of them talking about what their experience has been. So when I talk about the corn going to Mexico, the corn and soy go to Mexico, pork is fattened, hogs are fattened there, then brought back across the border for processing. So in this process of facilitating the investment, making it easier for companies to shift different aspects of production, to break it up, they gain more power in the food chain. So we see Mary Hendrickson has done a wonderful job of documenting this. My chart maybe could be a little bit better, but in any case, you can see that there is this growth. This is the C4 ratio, so the share of the biggest four firms in a given sector. And you can see that before NAFTA, the biggest four firms in pork slaughtering controlled 45% of the sector. After, more recently, 63%. And the statistics are the same in many sectors in agriculture. So farmers in this country, for example, have fewer options where to sell their goods. They gain less, they lose power in the food system, and there's more corporate control of our food system. This happened, of course, in Canada and in Mexico as well. So if we think about the problems we're facing, the food system that doesn't work, a food system that doesn't work, a farm system that's not working in both cases, we have to think about what kind of system we want And what are the rules we need to get there? I think one of the major flaws with the trade agreements is this basic assumption that if we facilitate trade, if we increase exports, then that will automatically result in gains for society. And it's a very simplistic view. Trade agreements could have different rules than they do, and they could be decided in different ways. So in the WTO, agriculture is, for the most part, in one chapter. In these agreements, they're woven throughout the agreement. So I'm going to touch on some of the places that are probably most important for agriculture and food systems in TPP and TTIP. So for the most part, tariffs on agricultural goods are already pretty low. Between US and Europe, I think the weighted average tariff is something like 3%, although there are some variations. And in the TPP, they're generally low, although there are some exceptions. And one of the big sticking points in TPP has been Japan's insistence, up till very recently, that it maintain protections for its farmers. Now, part of this is that things like rice production in Japan have a cultural and social importance that go even beyond their value as food. But it's also the fact that Japanese farmers are very well organized. Millions of people were out on the streets protesting the idea that they would cut this support, that they would open to U.S. imports. On the other side, we have the National Farmers Union in the U.S. was very concerned about opening up our dairy markets, particularly to exports from New Zealand, which is much lower priced than in the U.S. And what I think is nice about this statement is the two of them are coming together and talking both about their common interests and the fact that agriculture is different than other sectors. It's not the same thing as trading widgets. Agriculture, food, has connections to all levels of our society, and it needs to be treated differently. So another set of issues that comes up a lot in trade agreements is food safety. I would say right now that food safety rules are affected in two parts of the agreements. One is a chapter on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, where it's sort of the traditional place. There's also a new chapter in both TPP and TTIP on regulatory coherence. Here we know a lot more about what's in TTIP because a lot more has leaked from the European Union. In fact, the European Union has started publishing more information too. So in the case of TPP, one of the flashpoints has been Vietnamese shrimp coming into the United States. So here we have the issue that the shrimp may not be produced along the same standards as what we're used to in the United States, coupled with the fact that border inspection programs in the U.S. are horribly underfunded. Both the government and industry are basically refusing to pay for inspections, so we have this very weak system and a lot of concerns about what it could mean if the trade rules facilitate more imports. When I talk to people in Europe, including government ministers, about TTIP, I hear this constant refrain of no GMOs, no hormone beef, no chlorine chicken. Some of them add no cloned beef, which was something new to me. But these are all things they see in our food system that they're concerned about. Chlorine chicken, for those who don't know, our poultry is processed with such fast line speeds that it gets torn up in the process, and fecal matter and other things get in there. So the only way to get rid of the bacteria is to rinse it in bleach, basically, or bleach in water. In Europe, the rules are that it has to be produced safely in the first place, and they can only rinse it with plain water. So you can imagine Europeans aren't so keen on having that stuff enter into their food system. And in each of these cases, on each of these issues, there are comments submitted by corporations to USTR about their desire to get rid of those rules in the EU through the trade negotiations. As I said, the ministers keep saying no, but it keeps coming back on the table, so I think all of these things could come up. And the thing is, that they will boomerang back to the U.S. Like here we have a few states that have managed to pass GMO labeling bills. GMO labeling is really under technical barriers to trade, but it's a similar issue. There's pressure from the American Confectioners Association to get rid of GMO labeling in Europe. I'm not sure why, but it's in their comments as being important to them. if it were to become illegal for Europe under TTIP, it would be illegal here too. The U.S. is pressing Peru pretty hard on its limits on GMOs. So if it passes in TPP, it applies here as well. So a lot of the local level campaigns on issues like GMO labeling, like the ban on neonicotinoids in Oregon, like California's new rules banning eggs produced in battery cages, all of those could be deemed trade irritants. So these are on existing rules. But as I said, our food safety rules, and as I think most people know, our food safety rules are not what they need to be here. And in addition, we have emerging technologies like nanotechnology in food. Nanotechnology is already being used in food packaging, for example, and some other applications. And there's virtually no regulation. The U.S. has not yet arrived at a definition of what a nanoparticle is. And in Europe, I think they have a definition and some labeling, but in both cases, they really don't have rules to regulate it yet. The emphasis has been on the economic activity that could be generated by this scientific application, even though there are studies coming out of different places about how these nanoparticles can pass through cell walls and affect changes even at the genetic level. So we have this whole sort of body of technologies that's potentially pretty risky. And here, so we have the food safety rules in TPP or TTIP that say whatever rules you want to have, they have to be the least trade restrictive possible of the different options. And on top of that, these rules on regulatory coherence or cooperation. In TTIP, they would establish a council of bureaucrats, essentially, from both sides, so that any time a new rule was being considered, it would have to enter into this Kafkaesque process of new cost-benefit analyses, notice and comment periods, things that would slow down the whole process to a glacial pace. So we're concerned both that this will limit improvements in things we've already identified as being problematic, things, for example, like chlorine chicken, and for these emerging technologies. I mean, there's the nanoparticles in food and some consideration of synthetic biology applications for food as well. So things we should be concerned about and where we just don't have the process in place to make the rules, and we're introducing one more problem. When I started looking at TTIP especially, I was focusing pretty closely on public procurement rules. This is one of those new issues in trade. I mean, it's been there to some extent, but this is one of the issues that developing countries have, for the most part, refused to negotiate in the past. What I was concerned about, thinking about food system, are farm-to-school programs that give preference to locally grown foods. Giving that kind of preference for local content or Buy America provisions goes against the proposals in the trade agreements. Now you can see here that farm-to-school programs are big in the United States. There's a lot of money involved. This is really just the tip of the iceberg on public procurement. One of the things that's new with these agreements is also an emphasis not only on federal procurement, but state and local procurement programs, which is where about 2/3 of the procurement dollars are spent. So we're very concerned that these programs could reach into farm to school and other programs as well. And so in addition to local content requirements, when we think about public procurement in food, we have food policy councils across the country. There's something like 200 food policy councils. Probably the most impressive is the one in Los Angeles, which has developed this Good Foods Purchasing Pledge that now applies to the school system there. And in addition to buying local foods, some of the bidding criteria are around things like animal welfare or valued workforce. These, again, are issues that just don't fit with the notion that you would, in a trade agreement, that you would have procurement provisions that would allow for those kinds of criteria unless they're specifically written into the agreement. Now, so far, on trade agreements, feeding programs have been excluded, but we cannot assume that that's going to continue to happen. Each agreement is done differently. So this is an issue we've been working on a lot, working particularly with farm-to-school programs in the U.S. to get them to weigh in early to say they cannot include this. So we don't have a lot of, I don't have a lot of information. Bill may know more about procurement and TPP, but we know a lot about what's being proposed in TTIP. I was surprised to see that in TTIP, the EU has goals to reach very small levels of government, counties over 300,000 people, universities over 10,000 students, hospitals over 500 beds. And so there's a governance question there too. Who decides if a university is bound by that kind of commitment, particularly when there's mixed streams of income? For state procurement, it's the governor that decides, but there have been conflicts in which the state legislature has said they should be involved. Our big concern right now is that these conversations could be happening, and perhaps some states are already offering up that they would be open to these kinds of procurement commitments. So part of our issue right now is just to get people thinking about this, paying attention, and then thinking through under what condition, if a university, say, wants to do its procurement programs differently, probably beyond food, things like construction, or I don't know what else, what schools procure even. What's that? Clothing.
A lot of restrictions on university clothing.
Right. Those kinds of things could get caught up in these procurement rules. And as I said, universities and hospitals were specifically mentioned by the European Union. So the other big issue that comes up across the board in these trade agreements is what's called investor-state dispute settlement. This is a provision, didn't start with NAFTA, but I think we knew about it most starting with NAFTA, that gives foreign investors the right to sue governments over rules that undermine their expected profits. So not actual profits, and not necessarily rules that treat the foreign investor different than a local investor. There haven't been many cases yet involving food, but there are a number that I think have implications for work on food system change. Mexico.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Sure.
Would this provision keep new regulations, or would it actually force states to adjust their current regulations based on things in the agreement?
Well, they can't actually force changes in Bill knows this in greater depth than I do. For the most part, it's about getting compensation, not actually forcing changes, although politically, in effect, it does force different kinds of changes. And I think it's often about new rules, but not necessarily, right?
Oh, no, it can be enforcement actions.
Right.
It can be new administrative interpretations. So it's any kind of act of government. And again, it's money compensation for having to obey the rules, but if those awards keep piling up, obviously there's a strong incentive to go back and change the rules.
Right. Bill knows those issues in depth, and I imagine we'll have something to say about them. But in any case, as it relates to agriculture, Mexico has lost 3 separate cases over its limits on high fructose corn syrup. They put the limits in place not for public health reasons, but to protect sugar farmers in Mexico. But even if it had been for public health reasons, it really wouldn't have mattered. So Mexico paid $169 million in compensation over those rules. Australia is being sued by Philip Morris over its cigarette packaging rules, saying that the plain and really ugly packaging will undermine its expected profits and undermines its brand image, which I imagine is true, right? But that's sort of the point. But in any case, it was, so they have a suit against Australia, also against Uruguay. And in both of those cases, another issue that's interesting is Philip Morris, as a U.S. company, we didn't have investor-state provisions with Australia or Uruguay. So for the Australia case, it is a Hong Kong company. And for the Uruguay case, it's from Europe, right? Sweden? It's somewhere else. So I think one thing we're really concerned about as these things spread, a company could pretend to be from any country that gives it the most advantage to raise this kind of suit, anywhere it really has operations. And then a very recent case in Canada, Nova Scotia community decided to ban a salt quarry, which was close to a whale watching area, for a number of reasons. And the company sued and won. And this is something that's come up just in the last month or so. But one of the issues that was most alarming is the court, or the panel, found that part of what this was based on, part of the reason they turned down the quarry, was they said it went against core community values, which in that community had to do with protecting the environment for this whale watching area. The panel found that there was no meaning in core community values, that shouldn't be a consideration in these kinds of talks. So when we think about changes in our food system, I think that's something we'll certainly be seeing moving forward. There is a lot happening on trade right now. Fast Track, which will facilitate trade agreements getting passed, if it passes, could be introduced any day now. So there's a lot happening and a lot of different ways to get involved. And that's all I've got.
Very good.
We can talk a little bit more about getting involved at the end after Bill's presentation and some questions also. But yeah, there seems to be an agreement that they're going to try and put forth the bill for fast track beginning of next week. It looks like we're sooner, and we can talk about the chance of that passing also.
For which one?
I think for both.
For both.
Yeah, any agreement that would come within a period of somewhere between 5 and 8 years. We don't know exactly what the final text is going to say, but through that whole period, fast track rules would apply.
So it'd be giving fast track for things that haven't even been brought up yet.
Right.
Wow.
Certainly these two. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. This is a very important topic. And I think at the outset, we need to define our terms. We talk about trade policy and trade agreements, but in many respects, this is very clever political branding on the parts of the proponents of these new style, quote-unquote, trade investment agreements that really started with NAFTA and the World Trade Organization agreement, the Uruguay Round agreement a little over 20 years ago. Once upon a time, trade policy was about trade. It was about restrictions at the border, tariffs, quotas, that sort of thing. But for the past 20 years, we see a new kind of agreement that has a much wider scope and, from my point of view, a much more insidious effect. Renato Ruggiero is a former General Secretary of the World Trade Organization, quoting Professor John Jackson of Georgetown Law School, who's sometimes called the intellectual father of the World Trade Organization, that what they did in creating the World Trade Organization, and this would apply also to NAFTA and the new agreements, what they were doing was creating a constitution for the world economy. Now, what does a constitution do? It limits, or at least in the U.S. model, it limits the capacity of government to act. It sets limits in the Bill of Rights on what legislatures can do in the area of free speech. It protects property rights under the Fifth Amendment. It sets up rules of procedure, and all is intended to constrain and limit the role of government within some reasonable bounds. But what we see with these new agreements, the constitutional character is far broader, because the limits on government are far broader, and it's based on a kind of Thatcherite or alternative New Democrat, New Labor theory that government was the problem, markets are efficient, and we will all prosper if we get government out of the way, if we put in place international agreements that constrain the capacity of government to interfere with the market and the vital spirits of the enterprising classes. And again, I think it's very important to understand that basic characteristic of these agreements. They're not really, I mean, some of them are still about trade, but they're really limiting the capacity of democratic institutions at every level and of legitimate courts at every level in order to free up the market. With specific respect to the two pending agreements, the Pacific Agreement and the Atlantic Agreement and the environment, I'd like to review 8 specific areas where the legitimate role of government in protecting our environment and addressing global warming will be significantly impacted in a negative way by these agreements. The first threat is the one Karen mentioned, that's in the investment chapters, these investment tribunals, these sort of private courts for international capital, which can levy money damages as a remedy to legitimate environmental and climate regulation. The second one Karen also mentioned, and it's the whole regulatory review process, the regulatory coherence process, which creates institutions and procedures to very closely scrutinize and weed out administrative regulations. Of course, that's very important in the environmental policy area. And a heavy emphasis on reductionist cost-benefit analysis, which would overvalue the importance of corporate profits in relation to the hard to measure in dollar and cents value of protecting the environment and the climate. It's, and you give these very strange cost-benefit calculations where they'll calculate the value of human life based on future earning potential, meaning that a young, wealthy person's life is much more valuable in dollars and cents than a poor old person. And it doesn't, it's pretty hard to get a dollar and cents price on the value of wild places or preservation of a species of plant or animal, or just the intangible worth of having an unspoiled and clean environment. So again, a process, across-the-board process problem with these regulatory review provisions. Karen also mentioned, well, another thing with respect to climate policy in particular, there are provisions in the WTO agreement that will be incorporated by reference or replicated in the Atlantic and Pacific Agreement in the trade in goods or the market access provisions that relate to export controls. And it's a long-established rule in international trade law that there should be, except in the most unusual circumstances, no government restrictions on exports. And that's a big concern when it comes to the climate, because right now the United States is the fastest growing fossil fuel producer in the world, thanks to fracking and other techniques. And we are planning to use these agreements to step up exports of coal to Asia and petroleum and LNG to Europe and Asia, and in so doing continue to heat up the planet beyond the point where it's sustainable. The fourth environmental issue is raised, as Karen mentioned, that's the chapters in the TTIP and the TPP on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Sanitary measure is food safety And phytosanitary measure is an animal welfare provision. And again, it is not the purpose of the so-called SPS chapters in the Pacific and the Atlantic Agreement to improve food safety or to improve animal welfare, but rather to restrict government regulation in the name of food safety and animal welfare. The fifth environmental issue, the fifth environmental threat that I'd identify, again, Karen mentioned, and that's the technical barriers to trade chapters. And that includes, for these purposes, government regulations connected with product labeling, like dolphin-safe tuna labels. We just lost a case on that in the WTO. Or country of origin meat labeling. And then the other major environment issue under TBT chapters is regulation of dangerous chemicals and pesticides. Obviously, very, very important. The sixth.
So you're saying that they could remove dolphin-safe tuna labeling because it was considered a trade barrier?
Yeah, actually, the United States has lost several cases in the World Trade Organization, and it's refusing to comply. And at some point, there will be retaliatory trade sanctions authorized. So these tribunals do not have the authority, literally, to strike down your domestic laws and regulations, but they create a powerful incentive to change them, because if you do not change the law related to dolphin-safe tuna labeling, then Mexico and the other plaintiffs will be able to impose retaliatory tariffs or restrictions on intellectual property rights, for example, on U.S. companies, and put an economic hurt on those U.S. companies that will be sufficient to create the political momentum to roll back the dolphin-safe tuna label or whatever. And in the same way that the investment chapter, that those tribunals cannot strike down a U.S. law or Maryland law or Virginia law, but it can cost the taxpayers a load of money and thereby create a powerful incentive to repeal and amend. The next category of threat are intellectual property chapters. In this case, you're talking about multinational corporations literally taking title to the genetic code. A good part of the human genome is already owned by corporations, but they also want to get intellectual property rights to other living things, gene patenting included. There's also an issue of biopiracy, where they'll go into a pristine area and find a plant or animal species or a gene sequence in that environment that is part of the traditional knowledge of indigenous people or whatever, and then they'll patent and take title to it, and in effect steal that traditional knowledge. So the intellectual property is not just about patents and copyrights as we traditionally think of them. I mean, it's really a question of who owns the genetic code. The services chapters are very important. We don't know too much about their content. We haven't had a lot of leaked documents, but there are a whole range of things that fall under services: water services, solid waste services, hazardous waste service, electric water utility services, pollution control, transportation, oil, gas pipelines. All these are regulated by the services agreements of these two deals, and again, the idea is not to is to limit the capacity of government to regulate service industries, and that's the fastest growing part of the economy, both in the United States and around the world. And then the eighth threat that I would identify is again the one that Karen mentioned, and that's government procurement. And as the general rule in these trade deals is that government procurement should largely be limited to two criteria: price and performance. are the engineering standards met in terms of performance, and is the price competitive? And any kind of social or environmental criteria that might go into purchasing is, by definition, then suspect. So a very, very serious concern for us. Well, right now, everything's coming to a head in Congress. Hearing today in the Senate Finance Committee on what's called Fast Track Trade Promotion Authority. We expect a bill to be on the Senate floor soon and to be taken up in the U.S. House of Representatives within the next 2 to 3 weeks. It's going to be a very, very close vote in the House. Almost all the House of Democrats in the House of Representatives are opposed to President Obama's proposal for fast-track trade promotion authority, but Speaker Boehner and the Chamber of Commerce and every Wall Street and every major lobby group in the country is pushing this hard, and it's going to be a very closely run thing. These are procedural rules for considering trade agreements like the TPP and the TTIP in Congress. And the whole idea of fast-track trade promotion authority was conceived by a crafty fellow by the name of Richard Nixon. And whereas the U.S. Constitution makes it very clear that trade policy is to be made by the Congress and not the executive. It's the role of the executive to negotiate these agreements and implement trade policy, but that the very specific constitutional language on Congress's authority here. Remember that the American Revolution came out of a trade dispute, so the idea that an executive or a king could be dictating trade policy to democratic legislative institutions was anathema to the founders, given their recent historical experience. But Nixon had the idea that it's simply not practical in the modern world to negotiate agreements around the world when Congress could come back and take a sort of a second shot at the content of the agreement after the executive had negotiated the basic outline of it. And the problem here is that most other countries in the world are either not democratic governments, Vietnam or the Sultanate of Brunei that we're negotiating with in the TPP agreement are both dictatorships, or they are parliamentary democracies where there isn't the separation of powers between the legislative and executive, and the party that, or the coalition of parties that controls the parliament controls the executive, so you don't have that potential conflict. So there is some basis for some kind of an expedited and separate procedure for considering these trade agreements. But the way this new bill will be drafted, it really guts the authority of Congress, because the TPP and the TTIP would have to be considered very tight schedule on quick up or down votes, no amendments allowed, no filibuster, no extraordinary vote rules in the Senate. And history shows that given the money and power of the corporations and the financiers who support these trade agreements and their campaign contributions, that it's almost impossible for members of Congress to defeat these agreements when they're considered under fast-track rules. On the other hand, when fast-track authority is not granted, and it's always only granted for a period of years, then the balance of political power shifts. So what we have now in Congress is a fight over this fast-track trade promotion authority legislation, which is a lot of arcane congressional process issues, but in effect it is a vote up or down on the TPP and the TTIP sight unseen, the secret documents. So that's why it's so important. And it's a real threat to the environment. Thank you.